So I'm going to get this rolling. For the participants joining us, my name is Vishwas Satgar. I'm an academic at Wits University. But for today, I'm wearing two hats to facilitate this conversation. I'm currently also the board chairperson of the Cooperative and Policy Alternatives Center. COPAC has been a grassroots NGO come think tank. We've worked a lot on democratic systemic alternatives, ranging from cooperatives to eco-villages, to the solidarity economy, the just transition, and more. We've also done some work on the basic income grant, particularly in the context of us working with waste pickers and small-scale farmers, and recognizing that there is a deep crisis of social reproduction in our society. The other hat I'm wearing is as a co-founder and activist in the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign. The South African Food Sovereignty Campaign has been around for the past 6 years. It's a national platform, and basically it's a platform that allows converging partners to bring food sovereignty related struggles and issues to the fore. One of the things we've been busy with is the Climate Justice Charter. And in that context, we've been thinking also about the basic income grant for socio-ecological restructuring and the just transition. So that's the kind of bit of background to where I'm coming from. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to ask each of our participants and those that have been able to kind of come through just to briefly introduce themselves. And I'm hoping by then we have others. We're having one or two difficulties with one or two of our other panelists. But Rosheda, maybe just briefly introduce yourself, please.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rosheda Muller, and I'm the current president for the South African Informal Traders Alliance, which is a national organization that's present in all 9 provinces of South Africa. Of course, our key aim is to legitimize our sector. You know, we are being looked at as the alternate economy. I think it's important for government to realize that we need to be acknowledged officially, because we are just being still looked at nuisance value. But if you look at the statistics of who we are, and we don't claim to have them on our database, but we have stats from SA Stats, etc., that we're well into 3 million already. So for them not to recognize us as a business sector it's very disheartening. And later in the conversation, I'd like to talk about R204. But for now, yes, I am leading the South African Informal Traders Alliance, and there are other organizations, but I don't think any has come forth to represent the 9 provinces. We have been acknowledged by the Department of Small Business Development, but I need to know what the real acknowledgement is, because we have not truly been consulted at all in this process of this unprecedented times that we are going through, uncharted waters that none of us has ever seen. You know, the hardships of the informal economy workers, I don't think people who are not in the informal economy can understand, because we are the self-employed people. Being the self-employed vulnerable workers on the street, we do not have a safety net. And
can we explore this issue in much more detail now? Okay, Dominic, can you please introduce yourself quickly?
Thanks, Vish. I'm Dominic, and I work at the Alternative and Information and Development Center, or AIDC. We work with a number of trade union movements, unemployed people's movements, and other grassroots organizations, where we're trying to fight for a just transition towards a wage-led and low-carbon society, and that talks about the just transition talks about the socially, ecologically, and economically just transition that doesn't leave the poor and working poor left behind. And that's why a wage-led is so important. And included in this wage-led is not only the wage that you earn for what's formalized production, but also for unrecognized forms of production, including the informal sectors, as well as social reproductive work and tons of unemployed people who are also productive but who don't get recognized for those work. So we as EC have been looking as to how we can finance a basic income grant, one that is not just a once-off but a long-term measure, given the context that we're in. Thanks, Vish.
Thank you, Dominic. Isobel? Introduce
Thanks.
yourself.
Sorry, I'm trying to find appropriate headphones. Thanks very much for the invitation, and hello to everyone who's on board this discussion. My name is Isobel Frye. I'm the Director of Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute. We're a not-for-profit research and advocacy think tank based in Johannesburg. In addition to being part of the NEDLAC community constituency, where we've been debating a lot of these responses, I was also part of the original 2002 Civil Society Basic Income Grant Coalition and worked on that for a long time. And we also housed the SADC Basic Income Grant Coalition within SPI for a number of years. So I'm really look forward to this debate. I think more so than ever the time has come, and it needs to have critical thinking, ideas, and putting pressure on leaders who might not have the courage to adopt something as bold. And yet on an hourly basis, we're just hearing the recording of people's levels of starvation and destitution. I don't think that a better time would be than now, and I think any leadership that fails to meet this moment will have a lot to answer for.
Thank you, Isobel. Ayanda, you've joined us. Ayanda Kota from the UPM. And Ayanda, just introduce yourself. Yeah.
You want me to say something?
Yes.
All right. My name is Ayanda Kota from UPM. Akanda.
Okay, Ayanda. Comrade Marcus Solomon, would you introduce yourself, please? Marcus? I don't know. Can Marcus hear us? I don't know if Marcus can hear us. Okay, Duma, please introduce yourself, and we'll try and make sure that Marcus connects in. Yeah.
Hi, Vish, how are you? Thank you very much for the invite. My name is Duma Kubule. I'm a writer and researcher on issues relating to economic development and transformation. But on this particular issue, I must say that I've not done as much work as Isobel, and I entered this debate through the whole debate around the appropriate fiscal stimulus that we need to get our country out of this current situation. And it's landed on me that this is perhaps the most important. This is something that we'll talk about that later, so I mustn't go into the details of the content here.
Okay, great, thank you. Marcus, have you been able to plug in? Yes,
Can you
please
hear me
introduce
now?
yourself. Yes, please introduce yourself, Marcus.
Yeah. First, let me say hello to everybody. I'm Marcus Solomon. I'm from the Children's Resource Center, and it's been around for about 40 years. We have a website. People can go on there to get some of the details. There are almost more than 20 million children in this country. Half of them are girls. Actually, more than half are girls. And the majority are between the ages of 0 and 14. Of course, children, anybody between 0 and 18 is legally recognized as a child. Now, what we bring to the table is that children are not only beneficiaries of what a society is supposed to provide, but also active participants, potential change agents. And we've shown that over many years. And that's what we want to bring to this debate. We are very supportive of the basic income grant, but including the child support grant. But we think that's only a small but an important initiative and need, because children don't only need food, they need love and care and sports and intellectual stimulation, but primarily space to play.
Okay.
And of our kids, statistics show more than 10 million of them go hungry at different levels of hunger. And that is not always even satisfied, especially now. And that's why later on I will come and motivate more, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus, for that introduction. So we are into COVID-19. It's a global pandemic, and it is impacting almost all our societies on the planet. Basically, we have at the forefront a public health challenge, and the South African government has kind of put that into full throttle. We are in a lockdown over 3 weeks now. But alongside this is the whole challenge of socio-economic mitigation measures and whether enough has been done to make sure that we blunt the hard edge of this. And of course, the third leg to this is an economy that has ground to halt and grappling with the challenge of economic recovery. So I think it's in that context that we are thinking about a basic income grant. By definition, it's a resource transfer, non-means tested, to citizens. It's a very simple idea, and it's an idea that has a long history, and I don't want to get into it right now. But just to say that we've had a lot of international experience since the 70s, particularly in our Western democracies, from the US to Canada. We've had eventually examples and more recently in Namibia and currently in Kenya. And you've had an experiment in Finland as well. But in the context of the COVID crisis, over 80 governments globally have attempted to marshal resources to deal with socioeconomic mitigation. It is out-of-the-box stuff. They are breaking new ground. In places like Canada, there's debt financing and major cash transfers happening to citizens. In Spain, there's already a commitment to a citizens' basic income grant now, but also beyond this crisis. So it's becoming a systemic feature of that society. So that's kind of broadly the kind of context. But I just want us to maybe kick off this conversation with getting a perspective on how the crisis is biting. So maybe here, Rosheda, to come back to you, can you just tell us what's been happening to informal traders? I mean, overnight, their means of livelihood has been completely stopped. Can you give us a perspective on this?
Yeah. We need to understand the informal sector and how it operates. And I think government hasn't been close enough to us to understand who we are and how we operate. We all know that we are very, very vulnerable. We're on the streets. We are working from home. The informal economy, the broad perspective of home-based workers, fisher people, waste pickers, even the domestic workers, they are also informal. So at this point, when it is a lockdown, and we do believe that's the best thing to do for the safety, for life, that is what should happen. But the informal people are people who earn a living on the street, not by desire. They are there because of a necessity. And in particularly, like Marcus spoke about, more girls, it's the women in the informal economy that goes out there, the goes on the streets and that, and to feed their families. Now that has been cut off. Now, unlike the formal worker, we do not have social protection. We do not have UIF. We do not have health care. We have none of that safety net which formal workers may have, luckily for them. But it is the understanding that we, as self-employed people, as informal traders, have been surviving through decades and decades by self-sustaining. Now, for that, at least, there should be great acknowledgement because of the contribution to the GDP themselves. If we look at the stats that's out on informal sector, it's basically up to almost 4 million, and how many is still not known, it's not on the records. And if you multiply that feeding 4 people in a home, it's 16 million. These people's throats have been cut. There's no income now. Well, we've had a bit of relief with the fruit and veg and the raw meats coming out now, but we have many struggles with that. But basically to say our people are calling upon us day to day for that income, that basic income grant. They are dying. People are sending us messages of, I have 3 children, I have a baby, I need milk, what must I do? Now, this can have great repercussions. People are going to come to a point where they're going to strike. They're going to take to the roads, they're going to start, looting from shops. Are we driving a sector into crime now? Because now that we cannot earn a cent, because that's how we do our daily bread and butter, we are now forced to look at the alternate. And what is the alternate? If we do not get to this basic income grant, which we engage government a week before the lockdown, but all we got from the Department of Small Business Development is, we are looking into it. Watch the news. Wait for a broadcast that can be made. We cannot wait anymore. It is now that we're saying these people need a lifeline. And that lifeline must come through the basic income grant. So I am very pleased to be on this panel with you to express the feelings and the views across the country from our membership.
Thank you, Rosheda. Thank you. Ayanda Kota, can you give us a sense of the impact of the lockdown, etc., on unemployed peoples and what's happening?
All right. Thank you, Comrade Vish. Well, we were doing an interview with the local newspaper, Groots Mail, on the conditions of the lockdown. We were distributing the newspapers, requesting people to stay at home, to hustle and still be able to come back, to stop the spread of the virus. But one thing that came very clear was the issue of hunger. Maaputi Ngungata, who lives with his 2 children and the wife, he's got a surgical created hole in his throat that helps him to breathe. So he is relying on grant money because of that. So when we visited family on that day, there was no food. We also visited another family. Then they were talking about they do the piecemeal jobs, meaning you live from hand to food. With the lockdown, I mean, there are no more piecemeal jobs. The other family, Mbuyiselo Ntlanjeni, he lives by harvesting and selling wattle sticks, and so that people are able to build their shacks. He was saying because of this lockdown, these are the conditions of the lockdown. Because of the lockdown, he's not able to sell the wattle sticks for people to build their shacks anymore. It means that there is no income. They do not have anything. So I'm saying there are quite a number of interviews that we did trying to understand the conditions of the lockdown. We also spoke to ShopRite, Pick n Pay, the retail workers. They were going to UIF, to labor, to claim their UIF, because it means no more work. It will also be very difficult for these companies to absorb them after this, because they must still chase profits. They will not be able to chase profits if they absorb them back. And we know in the retail sector, majority of the workers are casual workers. It means there's no income. They have been pushed right into the extinction of the society. I mean, there's so much precarious work in this country with high unemployment rate. South Africa also, it's most unequal society in the world, with high rates of poverty, unemployment rate at 29%, highest in the world, which is a narrow definition. So the comrade was talking about the safety nets. I mean, you cannot think of any other safety net at the moment other than the basic income grant. It only makes sense, it is only appropriate that we ought to demand from the government to pay the basic income. Otherwise, I mean, we were distributing food from the office. Our target is that it's per week, where we reach 60 people per week, each week. So when I arrived in the office, there were more than 100 people who said, we heard from other people, they told us there was something on the Facebook, they were just in front of Masifundo office demanding food. We had to explain, I mean, it's so painful. You see these people, they are really in need of food. You stand there, you've got to explain to them that we do not, we've got the list and we have to stick to that list, we have to follow that list. And majority of the people on the people that were outside Masifunde, as early as 7 o'clock, when I arrived here at 9, they were telling me, we've been here and we've been waiting. And more than 80% of the people that were queuing were women, because the caring has been left in their responsibility. They are the most vulnerable in any patriarchal society. So I am saying the basic income grant we ought to demand. More than any other thing, it's whether you are doing an interview, whether on face masks or on sanitizers, people talk about hunger. Hunger is a big issue in this country. And there are kids that are not at school. You cannot lock them down. You will be doing injustices. You cannot lock them kids down, the kids who have got nothing to eat at home. You must allow them to go out and mingle with other kids. Otherwise, you'll be doing injustices to those kids. So I'm saying those are the conditions. It is not as if our people are defying lockdown, but you cannot close kids in home when you know they've got absolutely nothing to eat. They've got absolutely nothing to do. So the conditions of this lockdown, the brunt that we are carrying as the black working class in this country, it's ridiculous. So we've got to demand the basic income grant going forward.
Thank you, Ayanda. I want to go back to Marcus. Marcus, in terms of children, about 9 million children receive a hot meal in schools, at least before the lockdown. And that's made a big difference in their lives. And you mentioned the child support grant. But what is the situation on the ground right now? What are you picking up at the level of the CRC and so on? Marcus, we can't hear you again. Oh, what's happening? Okay. It's a pity. This is very valuable insight from Marcus. Okay. I'm going to change he's on mute. Somebody says he's on mute. Marcus, your microphone is muted. Can somebody get hold of him? Can somebody call him? Jane, can you call him, please?
No. It's just my negligence here. Sorry, Vish. I started speaking. Can I repeat?
Yes, please. Yes.
I'm sorry. Yeah. The issue I want to raise two issues of the school feeding schemes, but our work over many years was organizing children in the streets where they are staying through a mother staying in that street. Now, since the lockdown, of course, our resources have been very low, but 20 of these mothers in 5 provinces, Port Elizabeth, Durban, Soweto, and of course, Cape Town. They've strengthened what we call our little street kitchens, because we've been making wonder bags for many years. And around these, we've set up little street kitchens with a pot, stove, and so on. But this whole thing has come to a prominence now, because in all these streets, about 60 of these in different parts of the country, these mothers have been cooking food with a little bit of resources we've been able to get. Now, initially it was intended for our members, about 4,000 or 5,000 nationally. But when the mothers, and the photos are on our website, on our page, or what they call this thing, Facebook. The number of children who've come to these little meals that the coordinators are dishing out have tripled. They've had to turn away children, even adults. So it is very, very dire, because we're just about able to give maybe a guinya, a fat cake, and some pap and some whatever. So it's really the basic minimum. Then at some of the schools I know in Mitchell's Plain, through the department, and they've used some of the teachers and governing board members. They've also provided, but only one day a week, something. And our coordinators have been involved in that. So, but the other point is, if you notice at some of the looting where there's a beer outlet or a liquor outlet, it's the majority of the people there are children, the shops. And not only as spectators, by the way. The other day, and of course, what the cops do, some I've noticed, they pick up the children because it's easy. So they're also, besides most vulnerable in terms of food, there are two levels. In the street, they are most vulnerable because they can easily be arrested. But the other place, and we haven't information, but the statistics before even the lockdown, the most dangerous place for children is the home. And we've got a lot of evidence to show even before the lockup, children were getting the short end of the little bit of resources in the homes. So there, and I'm absolutely sure, there's hundreds of years of history where children get neglected. It's not going to change because of the lockup. So we can also assume, and that's why I say the food distribution, we have to set up structures. And I want to come back to that. The street structures with mothers, I'm not talking about party officials who've shown once again there's a bunch of rogues. They're stealing and looting, etc. So the issue of what sort of structures we set up is going to be a major challenge, colleagues and comrades, a major challenge. Because unless we sort out also how the food gets distributed, we are not going to ensure that the people who are supposed to benefit from it are getting it. And just on the small point about the small traders, it's not only the small traders. We've done surveys with about children. The most important shop in any street is the spaza shop. For sanitary towels, for 2 cents of sugar, or 2 potatoes, etc., etc. But of course, you're not going to get the support from this government because they're the servants of big capital. And we're having the same reports. I was involved with it in a class web, the Zoom thing that you people now have, webinar. The small farmers have the same problems. They are locked down with all the food that they've grown because people can't get access, because they can't even leave the village. So the small businesses, these are it's an important distributive mechanism for our people, but they don't get support. The children, of course, come back to that. I think we have to really begin to look at, and I'm calling upon the organizations, whether it's in Grahamstown or wherever, whether it's the small traders, we must make sure that we address the children. Okay. In fact, I saw a little article this morning in my last point. Some of the girls are asking, can't the sanitary towels be part of the food parcels? Anybody who doesn't know why they are saying that, because the small traders are not there where they could buy 1 sanitary towel. Because they go to the big shops, it's 20, 30 rand for a six pack.
Thank you for those insights, Marcus. So it's clear that we locked down one of the most unequal societies in the world. There was a crisis of social reproduction before this lockdown.
Yes.
And we've been pushed into this lockdown with all this reality. But the government's approach, Isobel, has been, well, you know, we have coping mechanisms, we have a social grant system. And what's your perspective on that? And how does that fit into mitigating the hard edge of what people are living through?
Is that for me, Vish?
No, that's for Isobel. That's for
Oh,
Isobel.
sorry.
Thank you. I think it's been really sobering hearing the other participants so far, and clearly points to the message going forward. But just in response to your question, Vish, I think it's important to remember that our social security system is actually based on an apartheid social security system. The idea being that it incorporated, was built on the assumption of a primary breadwinner being a white male, and that unemployment for a working age white male was limited by the reserve wage employment. And so people who fall out of that are children on the one hand, and old age people who are not meant to be working. So fast forward that to where we are. In fact, the current act is a rewrite of the 1992 Act. So that was before democracy, before our constitution. There's no right, there's no legislation around the right that everybody has to social security. And when we've engaged over the years with people within government, that really has been the response, is that working age people are obliged to earn their own incomes. Rosheda was talking about how many people have done this out of necessity, desperation. And yet we also know that the labor market itself is throwing people out by their hundreds of thousands, and now we're looking at an even more fragile working environment. So we have precarious workers at best, people who generally, the national minimum wage is an aspiration still for many. And the question is what the government's response to that is. We've seen an ideological opposition to extending social grants to working age people. And as I was saying to you offline, I mean, one can trace this back to medieval ideas about the poor laws, where you actually keep people trapped in a dependency. And you have the concept of the deserving versus the undeserving poor. So the deserving poor being the widow and the orphans, the undeserving poor being the layabout working age male. None of that is based in the reality of where we are right now. I mean, before the latest poverty stats in 2017 showed that 1 in 4 people in South Africa then was starving, was living under the food poverty line of 561 rand. I think for me, the current situation, it's been exacerbated by the cutting off of the coping mechanisms, the peace jobs and things like that Ayanda was talking about. But I think it's also bringing to the fore the ongoing existence of destitution and poverty and starvation that exists. I don't know how our government has not been able to yet come forward and say, people are the #1 priority, and this is what we're going to do. We understand that for a government in power, you don't want to promise something that you can't deliver for years to come. We've got no idea where the economy is going to go, what the revenue, the tax yield is going to be, or from a month-to-month basis. But people also know that if you say, we will promise this for 6 months, and we want the stimulus to go into the economy, but first and foremost, we want food in your mouths, and we want girls to be able to access sanitary towels and basic dignity. That needs to be the primary message, and other things built around that. Cabinet's meeting today, and we really hope that they'll be bold enough to make a declaration on this, because as previous speakers have said, I mean, this goes to the heart of our democratic constitution, to our social compact, but the levels of destitution, desperation, and anger as hunger sets in, is something which I don't think anyone would like to have to quantify, and it's not something that anyone deserves to live through.
I want to bring Duma in here. Duma, so, you know, what kind of macroeconomic space has there been for the government to mitigate the sort of impact of lockdown and so on? You know, compared to other governments, it seems like South Africa hasn't pumped enough of its GDP into the situation. What's your perspective on it? Again, we can't hear Duma.
Sorry, our response has been really pitiful. So most of the government response is not a real stimulus that involves the injection of new money into the economy. But if you add everything together, you get a figure that is less than 1% of GDP. And many countries have got up to 20% of GDP, the commitment. And if you look at the global response from all countries in the world, it's sitting at about 12% of GDP. So when we are finished with this crisis, if that day ever comes and we do the counting, we'll probably come to a response around 15% of GDP, which in South African terms is about 900 billion rands. So as I was trying to find solutions to this problem, I talked a lot with Isobel and people like that. And it came to me that I read all the proposals that were coming out in civil society. And I think that what came out was that a lot of the proposals were far too small to counter the scale of this economic crisis. Because let's remember that it is expected that the economy will decline by 10% this year. And during the global financial crisis, it declined by 1.5%. So and we lost 1 million jobs. So what is happening now is 6 times worse than what happened in the global financial crisis. And to try to project the jobs bloodbath that will happen, it becomes too frightening to even contemplate. So we need a really big response. And I saw that Ayanda Kota, she said there's no proposal that is too big for the scale of the challenge that we're facing. So I saw a lot of the proposals, very good. They were rather too small to counter what is required. So I would say there's 3 responses that are needed. So this recession has an impact on the demand or spending side of the economy, and it also has an impact on the production or supply side of the economy. So on the demand side of the economy, it is generally agreed that we have to put income into households, and that is the most effective way. So I think I was at a workshop last week at the presidency, and there was unanimous agreement that we have to top up the child social grant, and also perhaps also the old age pension. And then now, most people parked the idea of a basic income grant, but I do think that this is the most meaningful impact that we can have on our society. And we have to use this crisis to sort out 2 issues around this crisis. We have to invest in our healthcare system, and we have to develop a proper social protective system so that we don't have a situation, because these crises of global capitalism are now more frequent. And what I'm talking about, ones relating to climate, relating to finance, relating to public health. So we have to not leave our people so exposed again. So I believe that the basic income grant is what, and to talk about the financing of it, there are many ways to finance it, and Dominic will add to what I'm saying. But I would say we need to first focus, I think the Reserve Bank can fund this during this year, and then going forward, it will be very difficult. People are saying we must have it as a once-off. One of the proposals says it's a once-off payment of 4,500 from the IEJ, but I don't agree with that proposal, because we will be in this situation for most of the rest of the year, whether we have a full lockdown or a lockdown light. So we need to provide. And then the second thing is that I don't think, given our situation of poverty and inequality, that you can withdraw such a benefit once you've introduced it. So we should just bite the bullet, and we should implement this basic income grant. Now, lastly, on issues of affordability, what you must remember is that there is a whole issue of the impact this has on the economy. It stimulates local economy, and it creates some of the revenues to pay for itself. That's number 1. And then number 2, we can claw back some of it through the tax system, i.e. the people who are working can pay back into it. And also we can introduce new taxes going forward, not this year during the crisis, but going forward, relating to financial transactions, land, relating to wealth taxes. So I don't think affordability is an issue in terms of and then that no response is too big for the situation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Duma. So Dominic, Duma says, well, the cabinet has parked the basic income grant. So they're not willing to be innovative. They were not willing to entertain some very compelling arguments for the basic income grant, philosophical arguments, ethical, value-based arguments around freedom. I mean, the basic income grant is not individualistic. it goes to individuals, but it engenders solidarities across society. The basic income grant gives security to human beings. And that's in itself a very, very important thing. But in the thinking and the work you all have been doing at AIDC around the basic income grant, what are some of the arguments for it? And particularly in terms of the wage-led approach you've been talking about. People talk about digitization, the end of full employment, etc. But let's hear you.
Thanks, Vish, and thanks to all the rich inputs that have been given from now. I think really complemented and built on each other in a very nice way. I'd like to make a couple of points before looking exactly at the financing, and I'll try and be quite brief. The first point I think is building on what Duma initially or mentions quite quickly is in relation to the capitalist crisis. And I think that we once again see, because it's not the first time, that capitalism doesn't meet the needs of people. And particularly in this, I mean, that's easy to say, but I think particularly in the South African case, the statistics are quite stark. And here, Ayanda references mass unemployment. And I think the problem is not only mass unemployment. Those who are working are also being paid very little wages, mostly. And so you have a low wage regime, and this exacerbates massive income inequality as well. So I think this is the context that we must locate the question of the basic income grant in a country that hasn't met people's needs in a long time, within an unfolding global economy that's effectively collapsing, not for the first time. And I think we will see many more to come, as Duma hints at. Now, while I say all of this, I think we all know, which I was surprised no one has said this, is that South Africa is equally a very, very rich country, a very, very wealthy country. And this past weekend, I was just looking a little bit at how much wealth exists in South Africa. And we already know that wealth is heavily skewed, even more so than income inequality, with effectively 90% of the population having accumulated most of the wealth in this country. 10% of the population having about 90% of the wealth. Sorry, I mixed up that. And it's very hard to actually get an exact amount of how much wealth exists, because mostly people conceal that for a variety of reasons and in a variety of ways. But the report by a bank says that released last year, that there's more than that South Africans have accumulated more than $650 billion in private wealth. Now this in rand terms, in today's exchange rate, is about 11.7 trillion rand. It's a huge amount of money that very few people actually have their hands on. And in a context where people are starving, not only in the conditions of under the coronavirus, but before that, and the coronavirus only exacerbates. Why are we not redistributing this wealth? You should have done it more than 2 decades ago. And once again, I think we have to say, now's the time to put in a wealth tax. And something as small as a 1% or a 2% wealth tax raises something like over 117 billion to more than $200 billion. Rand, each year. It's an incredible amount of money. And I would say, if you look at a grant of about 1,860 rand, which is the equivalent to the older pension grant right now, which is what the C19 People's Coalition are proposing, then what you will see is that this would be equivalent to about $223 billion rand. Sorry, I don't know why I'm saying dollars all the time. To government each year, for 10 million people who are unemployed effectively, and quite a bit of this can be retrieved through value-added taxes, and then almost a lot of the rest can be paid through via a wealth tax, a very small one in fact. Now, as Duma says, it might not be possible to realize the revenue from a wealth tax immediately. And so in this case, given the urgency of the situation, we have to look at other sources of income that may be at our disposal. And yeah, I think looking at looking at how much money the Reserve Bank can print within this crisis is very important. And Chris Malakane makes a point that the Reserve Bank can actually print more than 200 billion rand quite safely. And there are a number of other pools of finance, including public pension funds, that despite the crisis and the massive hit that the stock exchange experienced, is still in quite a healthy financial situation. And in fact, we really need to remove this finances. Just the crisis affirms once again, the stock market crisis, that we need to remove this funds out of the stock exchange and redirect it into a social investment, into the real economy. And some of this can be borrowed to government at concessionary interest rates that would actually be more beneficial to the pensioners and workers who's currently contributed to the fund than the investments in the stock market. And so I think these are the types of things, and we need to explore all these possibilities of domestic finances, including taxing the rich. Yes, I see someone saying it, extra charge on luxury goods, and all of these things. By the way, I think there's some incredible comments in the chat as well that we should try and bring in. And so these are some of the things that I think we need to look at in terms of the financing. And moreover, we should also indicate that we need to hike up personal income tax rates, particularly of rich people, those who are earning more than 500,000 rand to more than 1.5 million rand per month. And I was just looking at it. In the past, South Africa actually had personal income tax rates of about 60% for high income earners between the 1970s and the 1980s. And to progressively hike up income tax rates to that amount, where you earn 1.5 million rand per year, you get taxed about 60% of your income. That can raise an additional 90 billion to 100 billion each year. And once again, I think in the context where we have mass income inequality, for me, these things should be no-brainers. Obviously, there are many no-brainers. For instance, there was a very commonsensical demand to increase the child support grant to top it up by 500 rand. And it's more than 2 weeks late and still it hasn't been done. And this would cost, 6.5 billion rand. Something that Johan Rupert or Harry Oppenheimer can pay for themselves without blinking an eye. So I think we have to, the question about how we organize, considering how long the fight for basic income grant has been coming along, considering how even 100 rand back in 98 to early 2000s wasn't accepted as a basic income grant. How are we going to win this measure? I think that's the critical question. One quick point, sorry, comment, which I know I spoke and others I know I spoke long, but one of the things I really think we need to think about is that as much as we're advocating for basic income grants, and now we're also hearing business coming out in support of it, we need to question why. And I think it's because business comes out in support of this because they can see that this can feed the ulcer, this can feed capitalism without really changing much of the structure of the economy. And so I think there's a number of things that we have to address in terms of this. That's one, redistributing wealth and income is key. But also I think we have to rethink about work and incorporate it in our demands. I think has to be the right to work. I mean, there's so much work that needs to be done in this country. We need houses, we need proper public transport, the health care that's needed. And once the lockdown is done, I'm not saying everyone must go and build houses now. I'm not that mad, just a little bit. And I think that once we need to look into those types of measures, it is going to allow us to be able to provide the cushion for most of the people that don't have it right now, as these crises, as these pandemics, etc., become more prevalent. What about a conscription program, not into the military, but into the health services that comes with a decent pay, and to rolling out a mass public socially owned renewable energy electricity system. Okay. And yes, of course, we have to combat profit shifting. Sorry, I'll stop there.
So these are very important points. I mean, if you like, empirical issues in our society, sharp inequalities, hunger, the unemployment challenge, that help make the case for a basic income grant. But I think Dominic has also helped us appreciate that it is not a silver bullet. It's not a solution in itself. It has to be complemented by a host of other transformative measures in a society. Now, you know, as you point out, Dominic, you know, business, the Financial Mail has called for a basic income grant. Many commentators in the business day, Duma excluded, but others as well, have called for a basic income grant. The Pope has called for a basic income grant. So let's just focus this discussion a little bit about what it is. It was a question also posed by Sydney Luckett. So let's just work through this idea of a basic income grant. The first thing about it is that it's basic. So it's a minimal transfer of resources to citizens, which means it can be a small amount, but it can be incrementally extended and increased over time. So that's the first point about it. The second point about it is that it is income, okay? So it's a cash transfer. Nowadays, it can even be a digital transfer, if you like. Because, you know, money in a capitalist economy is not just a tangible material thing, okay? So it can be a transfer. So that's very, very important. The other point about it is that it's meant to be universal. And that means that it's meant to embrace everybody in a country. And here, you know, we got to be very careful with the word citizen. And I would say it will embrace everybody living in a country, okay? So it's not exclusionary as a grant. And of course, the other thing about it is that it is not means tested. Now, a lot of the means testing that we have going on relates to what Isobel was talking about disciplining the poor, classifying the poor, controlling the poor. And so, you know, if you look at the means tested mechanisms, they immediately kind of stigmatize you. It's a humiliating process. You have to, as a citizen, register yourself as, if you like, deserving, okay? And so the basic income grant does away with all of that. Even if you're on a disability grant, you've got to constantly renew, you've got to prove your health condition. There are also other ways of testing citizens for eligibility. There are behavioral tests as well in other parts of the world and so on. So welfare mechanisms, as we've inherited them from the 20th century, they can be, if you like, very stigmatizing and so on. So the basic income grant allows us to shrug off all of that as well. So there's two dominant proposals, and some of that has emerged in the South African debate. The one is you have this cash transfer to citizens, non-means tested, and it's specified at a certain amount. The thought experiment we did in COPAC around a people's referendum on 4,500 largely fits into that. And it's about trying to consolidate resources that are there, that are potentially there from an economic perspective that could make this thing work. But there's another kind of basic income grant as well. And that basic income grant relates to the commons. And it is called a dividend of the commons. So whether it's our water, whether it's our land, whether it's our biosphere and so on, you could set up common funds and you could have allocations from the wealth of society socialized into this fund. Carbon tax, for example, is a tax related to the commons, and that can channel money into a commons-based approach to it. I don't want to complicate the debate, but I'm just saying that these are some of the approaches to a basic income grant. Now, where do we stand in South Africa? I mean, I think that right now we have an emergency situation. It makes common sense, it makes policy sense, it makes intellectual sense to move in the direction of a basic income grant. Now, some of you have alluded already to the wealth resources we have in the country, etc. Are there any other thoughts? And it's coming up in the conversation here around ways of financing the basic income grant. Are there any other thoughts? Isobel, in the work you've done around financing the basic income grant, what would be the mechanisms?
Hello, Vish. I'd like to come in.
Okay, let's give, Isobel, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to quantify, because I know you were talking about 4, 5. I think frequently we talk about good ideas without saying what they would cost. So some colleagues of mine have done a study, and without saying that this is what I endorse, they've just looked at a study of a basic income grant of the food poverty line. So that's 561 Rand per person per month. And they've run the figures, excluding all current grant recipients, but everybody else from the cradle to the grave getting it. And that would amount to 56.6 billion Rand. So that's the price tag. And I think Duma would come in and Dominic and say that really is not unaffordable. So if we're talking stimulus to the economy, as you were saying, that's a direct stimulus that basically would resuscitate the lifeblood of many communities. With regards to where that would come from, we're looking at the Unemployment Insurance Fund that has a vast surplus. Now, the concerns around that is that government says that money in the UI fund belongs to workers and employers. There are arguments to be made that, notwithstanding Section 25 of the Constitution that guarantees private property, that in extreme circumstances, that is something which the state should be able to appropriate. In addition to that, the compensation fund has a fair surplus as well that could also be tapped into. I think that Duma's spoken about a transaction tax. This was spoken about a number of years ago. I think that we need to get out of the binary that government puts us in, which is to say, it's not really a binary, but to say you've got a limited envelope, tell us where we must cut from. I don't think this is a case of cutting. I think this is a case of adding wealth. And so finding additional resources where that can come from. People talk about borrowing from the IMF, etc. But as Dominic said, we have got vast amounts of wealth in this country. I mean, the fact that individuals can pledge R1 billion suggests that possibly that there's just vast amounts of wealth that we haven't seen, as well as a land tax. So in short, because I know that everybody's got a lot of answers to this, we're looking at an affordable amount. We're talking about 400 billion plus stimulus into the economy. And I think that we need to include in that the stimulus that goes to people. And finally, my view would be, this is not being told, we've got to cut from existing pockets. It's about finding new sources of wealth.
Excellent. So Marcus, you wanted to come in on something related to...
Thanks, Vish. Just a remark. I think that I've always said for many years, the debate about the size of the big, we've won many years ago. What we failed, and some people are already asking, why isn't it happening? And I think what's missing is the people's voice and the people's power in this. It will become more than a debate. People have already decided how they are going to distribute the wealth. They are going to loot. And you can lecture to them, they must first not loot the liquor stores, they must go to the supermarkets. The thing is, they're already doing it. And I think we must answer some of the questions from Jane and Courtney. How do we begin to make this? People are not participating in this debate. They've got their own way of debating this issue. They are going to loot. And the unfortunate thing is, there's a lot of racism. There's a lot of prejudice. There's a lot of antisocial behavior. And that's why the looting of the liquor stores is an indication of who controls out there. The other thing, in some of the countries where it can happen, for example, in Spain, they've got a very good health system. If you add the nationalization of the public health system, the role of the army, which has huge resources, the churches have hundreds of thousands of ground and buildings. I think so that our communities in the congregations and the mosque and the temples can begin to say to the churches and to the faith-based organizations, where are you in this? Because this debate has been going on for a long time. And I'm saying, and the people have already spoken, the debate now, Vish, with due respects to all of us, is becoming a luxury. We need to look at how, and again, Jane has asked, how do we distribute all this? And if there are no structures, street committees, controlled by mothers, by the way, not the ward councillors. In fact, I've just read an article, 18 million that was sent to the Southern Cape is gone missing in the middle of a serious death and lockdown. In fact, the remedy is worse than the illness. And that's why people are going to take to the streets. And you know what the end result is going to be? A COVID-19 Marikana. It's on the cards. I hate to see it, but it is going to happen. This is my last point. This morning I had the Boweni faction in the cabinet is strengthened now. And you know what that means? He's already turned down the child support grant. He's going to turn down this thing. They have, what they call it, they've parked it. It's not a park. It's a fucking closing down of this whole debate. They are controlling the situation. Let's do what we did in the 80s. Go to the people, raise the awareness about what we are saying, and then set up the structures. Street committees, of course, I won't even speak about the unions. I've heard debates in PLAS. There are many organizations out there. What we need to do now is to begin to see how we coordinate some of this.
Yes, no, that's a good point, Marcus, and I agree. We have to snowball this, and we have to marshal mass power around this, and that's why we put out a people's referendum.
Yes,
in the context and the conditions under which we're trying to struggle. It's one mechanism to reach as many people as possible. So here I want to bring Rosheda back into the conversation, and Ayanda and so on. Comrades, can we mobilize your member bases to endorse the people's referendum? And so that as an online activist tool, we get thousands, maybe millions of people endorsing a big now. I think this is the challenge. So how do we reach the people? I'm posing that question. We've got one proposal on the table, a people's referendum. What are your thoughts, Rosheda? What are your thoughts, Ayanda?
Vish, I think it's very important to reach the people. Yeah. For so long, we as an organization have been asking to be heard, to be consulted on issues that concerns us as the sector, to partner government in solutions for the sector. They've never come to the party. We can send the documents, they can acknowledge the documents, but nothing has been implemented. It's time for implementation. Now, the people's referendum, yes, we would agree to that. But the engine behind that is the big. The basic income grant will push every informal and unemployed person to the street to take up the revolution on we need to change things in our country. Almost definitely we have 9 provincial structures, but lack of resources. But I'm sure, in some way or another, it can be done. Not most of our people do not have basic things like a cell phone, or, we can't really get to them by their WhatsApp and that. But leadership and controlling organizations, they're there. So they'll have to go into the field to mobilize. But most definitely, if we want serious action, we'll have to get the people involved. We've seen what happened now the other day in Mitchell's Plain, when people started looting and people started, it's the street mothers that's, don't know how they are getting the little bits together to feed the street at the moment, in Manenberg, everywhere. But it is boiling, that pot is brewing. We have to come out with a people's voice, definitely.
Thank you. Ayanda, around mobilizing your base and people.
Oh, thanks, Comrade Rich. Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I think it's people's referendum. It's an innovative idea, but I think we need to think hard on the implementation part. Something that could capture the minds and imagination of the people. I'll just be too much and say, for example, we can say I'm just making an example, on the 7th of September, it's an election day, it's a voting day on the referendum. The people's movements will be putting up voting booths throughout the country, where people will be going in and then exercising their right. Just to make sure they are part, and because what we have seen, the voting and the voting booth has become something of this current bourgeois system. So yeah, I'm saying I support it, but we have to think very hard. For example, if you are in Makanda, if you're in Cape Town, in Makaza, in Cape Town, or in Kailicha, you know what is expected of us. We'll be having t-shirts, people will be encouraging people to go and exercise their right to vote on the matter. So yeah, I support it, but there has to be a lot of thinking.
I want to bring in Duma and Dominic one last time before we open it up to participants. So Duma and Dominic, you know, there are other challenges facing us. I mean, one is just the economic paradigm, right? And you know, we assume that, you know, the economy globally even has gridlocked, has ground to a halt. Neoliberalism is, if you like, suspended. But clearly it's a specter, it's haunting even the current imagination of the government. I mean, that seems to be one of the challenges. But Duma, maybe you should talk a little bit about how do we get a political leadership right now to appreciate the scale of this challenge, the kind of requisite response, and breaking with the paradigm that is just so if you like shallow in how it understands even societies and economies. And maybe there's other challenges and solutions you want to highlight to us, and then I'll go to Dominic, and then we'll open it up. Comrades, can we hear Duma?
Nope.
So Vish, I've tried so much to explain the scale of the crisis. And quite frankly, sometimes I feel that the message is not landing, because let me be honest, I think the president is oblivious, seems apparently oblivious or willfully ignorant of all the alternatives that are being put there by civil society. And, you know, we had this workshop at the presidency, and everybody was saying a different tune to what actually is the orthodoxy in our government. So I don't know if they're going to send a message to the presidency that this was the view of the people, that it was actually unanimous, as someone was saying, that we need to top up the grants. We need to increase the food, the emergency food budget to about 1.5 billion per month. So I actually don't know what to do to explain the scale of the crisis, but I don't know. The other thing is that if we do nothing, and I was listening to if we do nothing, the economy will collapse. And if we do something, we might save the economy from collapsing. So I'm not sure, Vish, what to do. And the thing is, I think people must understand there are lots of solutions as to how we can finance. I don't think the issue of affordability is the issue, but the key for me is to understand what Isobel was saying, that this thing has its own benefits that are related to new economic development and new areas of economic development. And also it extends beyond the economy towards issues of social cohesion and so forth. So we just have to keep banging on the same message until someone actually listens. Yeah, I don't think, to be quite frank, that we're very far away. I think I've been hearing from a lot of people that there's kind of a shift in the mood in society and also in the ruling party, where people are open to this idea. So I just think that we have to just keep on the same message that everyone is having today amongst all of us. And one day the message will land here. Thank you.
Thank you, Duma. Dominic, do you want to come in quickly around challenges and what needs to be overcome to advance the basic income grant beyond an ameliorative politics? Because the situation doesn't require an ameliorative politics. It requires a transformative politics. Dominic.
Yeah. So I think we have seen an unquestioning commitment to an economic policy that's failed year after year, decade after decade now. And the conditions have just...
Louder, please.
Sorry, can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
Thank you, Dominic.
I think what we've seen is an unquestioning commitment to an economic policy that's failed year after year and for at least 2 decades now in South Africa and many more globally. And I honestly don't know beyond mass upheaval from below what it's going to take to bring around the transformative measures that we really need. There's an announcement going to be made by Treasury soon and the President around economic reforms that they're proposing. And I really hope that common sense will prevail and that you'll see a 500 rand top up to the grant. The 6.5 billion rand to pay for that should not even be taken too seriously at this stage. I just want to say, Vish, that I think in terms of the chat, I think this has to be rolled out now, immediately. We're facing a humanitarian crisis. Already people are starving, okay? I think the how can easily be overcome. And one of the ways I think is that everyone should have a SASSA card immediately rolled out, which can be done quite quickly. And based on your ID number, that will go to SASSA and to SARS, your card will be loaded with credit or not credit. Okay, so I think that can be done very, very quickly. I just want to say that there's 2 other points I want to make. The one is, given how dogmatic, how dogmatic our government has been, I get really worried when we propose something as timid as 500 and odd rand, because we know government would probably not even do that. And I think we know that is severely inadequate, and that anything below really 1,000, above the upper bound poverty, anything below the upper bound poverty line, I feel is not a transformative measure. It is, in fact, it's regressive, and we must be advocating for more. And then I just want to say 2 quick points. Some people will say, but inflation. Comrades, you want people to die first while we worry about inflation. I think inflation can be mitigated by people having purchasing power, and that purchasing power can overcome rises in food prices. But moreover, through central planning of the state, we can demand that shops do not rise prices and enforce it more strictly, because we're still seeing it being done after that announcement has been made. And moreover, perhaps the state should make a requisition from these major shopping centers to give food parcels to people without charging them, particularly those with SASSA cards or whatever the case may be. And then last point I want to make is that all of these measures, when we talk about it, and when we make these very progressive demands, we must know that the other argument is, well, the rich are just going to run away. And that is why we must always talk about the importance of controls on capital outflows, money, wealth leaving the country very quickly as soon as there's a whiff of some progressive measures being taken, because the rich in this country are very conservative and don't want to share their wealth with the majority of the poor. And it's racist and completely against, but it should be expected. And that's why we need to have movements to appropriate that wealth.
Okay. Thank you for that. We have a few minutes left, so I'm going to kind of try and pull in. We have been trying to pull in some of the chat input into the engagement, but there are specific questions I've opened up the Q&A line as well that I just want to throw to people. Let me see. So Ryan Edwards says, the problem with the wealth tax is that there will be a massive objection from status quo because it doesn't get to the bottom of what wealth is socially produced versus privately produced. Whereas if wealth is taxed through the commons, land value, natural resources, etc. tax paradigm, one can clearly argue for taxing the private use of commonwealth. This is more of an upstream tax. This would be more in line with the George's paradigm, where unearned gifts like land are the focus of tax rather than income. However, it would probably be easier to do wealth taxes and progressive taxes in the short term with the current institutions. I just worry about the buy-in. Okay, so I don't know, any thoughts on this from anybody? Around taxes, different kinds of taxes, wealth tax, resource-based, commons tax.
To say that, that there's a lot of wealth in pension funds in this country, both public and private. And while I think that some of those can be used can be redistributed at loans given at lower than market interest rates. So I think we must distinguish between the types of wealth that we want to tax. So I'm not ignoring that point. I think it's critical, and that the wealth tax shouldn't be a regressive one. And there's others who have other comments against implementing a wealth tax. But I think that there's sufficient arguments also that illustrate why, including from Ingrid Woolard, was part of the Davis Tax Committee, who said contrary to the Davis Tax Committee that the wealth tax is needed. So I think that there are strong arguments why a wealth tax can be implemented and how it can be implemented in very progressive ways.
So, you know, it's
just to come in here quickly.
Yeah, sure.
So I was referring earlier to the fact that we need to create new tax bases. So the Tobin tax was something which I'm sure everybody in this webinar would be familiar with. And that certainly is doable. It will also possibly slow down the flight of financial transactions. Yeah, the point about the wealth tax is that would take some time to understand, because the wealthier man better able at hiding the information about them than others. But then, I mean, the third option is, there was an interesting point put forward by Peter LaRue to the Taylor Committee, and this is going to be shot down because people are going to shoot it down without listening. It's not to say that it's transformative or I endorse it, but he argued that if you increase VAT by about 3%, I can see everyone's faces going furious, but pay a universal income grant and then you stagger VAT on luxury and imported goods, the net benefit is pro-poor, starting at the lowest income deciles and then significantly decreasing as people have more income. So what I'm saying is that, again, everyone has pointed out, all these arguments have been made for many years. I mean, I remember Marcus in early days with the BIG coalition. And in fact, at that point in time, when we said how affordable it was, we just heard another argument coming forward. And hence what we really need to do, to a certain extent, we don't need to identify to the absolute sort of dot where the money is going to come from, but we need to have a popular upswell of demand from this, because it's been amongst some of us who are great at talking for far too long. This needs to be ignited, as people have been saying, in terms of the revolutionary core, because otherwise we can just be ignored.
So the conditions are really ripe for a basic income grant. It's almost self-evident that you need something like this right now. But you know, sometimes based on what I would call thinking about the poor, there's this disparaging and paternalistic attitude that the poor don't know what to do with money. Okay. And here again, you know, we also got to be able to hold our ground against this kind of perspective. And I think international experience is very, very valuable here. Does anybody on the panel want to share any insights about international experiences and examples of attempts at basic income grants, or some form of experiments and schemes that are like this? Anybody?
Okay, just very quickly, the one I do know about is in Alaska, a state in the US, which is the Alaskan dividend that was been going for since the late 70s when oil was discovered. And it was paid into a sovereign wealth fund on the basis that the proceeds of a depleting resource should not be in the hands solely of politicians. And that's being paid out regularly on an annual basis. In addition to that, there have been a number of pilots across the world. And the problem about a pilot is that you're almost trying to disprove a positive. And I know that Spain just announced, as was mentioned recently, the introduction of it. And of course, the really positive experiment in Namibia. But to answer your question, I am only aware of Alaska having a sort of multi-decade implementation.
Yeah, that's almost an example of a commons-based approach to the basic income grant, actually. And unfortunately based on fossil fuels, but nonetheless, they've been doing it, which is kind of interesting. I want to focus the discussion a bit about rollout now. So let's just say the government listens to us. And I like to dream, I'm a dreamer. So let's just say the government listens to us and they decide they want to embrace a basic income grant. How would this be rolled out right now? Any thoughts on this? And it's come up in the questions and so on. What mechanisms are there to get this redistributive transfer to people? And here we're saying universal, all citizens. And how would a leadership in a state make this happen in South Africa? Let's assume this committee is in power. How would you make it happen?
Vish, may I?
Yes. Yeah, go for it.
Well, some people have said there's already a social grant mechanism and system in place. Yeah. Those need to be topped up via the childhood support grant, the pensions, the unemployment fund, the whole range of structures. Yeah. And I don't want to go into the other, because we've got a modern technologies, what they call a technological system, computers, etc. Dominic has mentioned the ID numbers, etc., etc. So personally, I don't think that's the big issue. I think the biggest hurdle right now is to actually get the powers that be, and they've always been the ones just to stop it. In 1950s already, by the way, in the United States, Nixon was about to legalize a basic income grant. He was stopped by the corporate world. Tito Mboweni is just going to say, no, there's not enough money. And there we go. Yeah? So I think there are basic mechanisms and systems in place already that could be upgraded, like the children's support grant, etc., etc. Yeah. Oh yes, the other thing is there could be other things, and I'm just being opportunistic now. There's for example, the issue of land, small plots where people can just spread the space for children. And then of course there's the big one, the basic food and health industry. We need to do something about that to mitigate some of the heavy burdens of food distribution and access to health, basic stuff, lip ice, Panado, etc.
So, I mean, we're assuming that the state can handle this thing, right? But, you know, we've had a weakened state over time here. Isobel, your thoughts from where you're sitting about how this can happen right now?
Right now, I think it is doable, as I put in the chat box, just from a pragmatic as opposed to a transformative perspective. There's something on the statute books known as social relief of distress, which has its history in emergency relief funds, but actually through legislative sort of, I think, sleight of hand, became a social grant. It's available to everybody if they can prove that an event happened which put them into distress. So it's not long-term destitution. And I've been speaking to some people who used to be top decision makers in social development. And they were saying that from a political perspective, using social relief of distress is feasible because it's short-term in nature. It doesn't offer a long-term entitlement, which, again, as I said, it's the pragmatic approach. But people just need to present themselves to a SASSA office. Regulations can be used to waive any kind of means testing. And what people are arguing in Department of Social Development is, in addition to a top-up of the child support grant, to roll out a cash payment, not food parcels, but cash payments through social relief of distress.
Yes.
I've also shared that Namibia recently, in the last week, announced a universal basic income, a once-off payment, which would be registered through mobile phones, and payments will also be done through mobile phones. So we have examples right on our borders of how it can be done. We know that our telephony and banking systems are incredibly adroit at finding solutions when they have profits to make. So the solutions are there, and it's just about putting the political will to implement the solution.
Any other final thoughts from anybody around making it happen? Because I'm going to wrap up the few concluding comments. Rosheda, anything from you?
Well, I always said that, you know, as an organization for informal traders, that we should also be used, you know, to assist government in rolling out, to maybe verify those traders who are in our databases, etc. But yeah, I like the idea of Dominic and the SASSA system that's already in place. And for those who do not have it, then for them just to acquire it.
Okay, I want to thank all our panelists for excellent contributions to this conversation and debate. It's clarified a whole set of issues. I also want to thank our participants who've been streaming a whole set of important contributions into the conversation. So, you know, Victor Hugo said something like, you know, there's nothing more powerful than an idea, when the time has come for an idea or something. Now, this is it. I mean, the crisis is obvious. There's a squeeze exactly. There's a squeeze that has been on our people for a long time. That squeeze is intensifying under this lockdown. It's self-evident. The argument is making itself. But clearly, at the same time, those who feel that economics stands in the way of it actually don't have a compelling argument. From what we've heard on this panel, resources are not an issue, okay? There are resources at a whole host of levels. There's various taxes, mechanisms, etc., that can be put into place to make this happen. Actually, the argument we've heard on this panel is that not only is it about mitigating the socioeconomic crisis on the ground, this can be part of a people-led recovery, a precariat-led recovery out of this crisis, which I think is very, very, very important. We don't want capital to lead the recovery out of this crisis, because we'll have and continue to have high unemployment, high inequality, etc. So this is an idea that can really tilt the balance in our society. But more than that, what we've also heard is that there aren't any institutional obstacles to implementing a big now, actually, both from current international examples that are unfolding right now, even on our continent. There are states that are making this happen, and these resources and these transfers are going to people. You don't have to just look at the global north to recognize that this is something that, again, is very relevant, very appropriate for our times. I think the other point to make is that we need to make more noise. We need to make noise, not even after a cabinet announcement and after one or two top-ups of a few things and grants, etc. We need to keep this noise going. As I said, the time has come for a big, and we need to ensure that this goes beyond even the first couple of weeks of our suffering together, but beyond this as well. In the context of climate crisis, the basic income grant is absolutely essential for the restructuring of our society, to help stranded workers in fossil fuel industries, etc., to make the transition. In the context of digitization, where the ILO is even talking about the end of full employment and so on, the big again becomes very, very important. So this is an idea that we got to constantly, if you like, be barking, we got to be arguing for, we got to be mobilizing for and organizing for. And to end with this, comrades, we have put a proposal online. It's a people's referendum. We invite all individuals and organizations to consider it in the light of this conversation, signing up. As we said, it's a thought experiment, but it's about pushing the horizons of our thinking and debate at this point in time. So please, let's take it into our organizations, let's take it into our community spaces, and let's get people to sign up. By next week, we want to issue a statement on this basic income grant proposal. We are happy that the Institute for Economic Justice at least did some costing on this, 150 billion rands, mainly for adults receiving this right now. But of course, I would agree that we should try and make sure that we keep the momentum going for something like this. It becomes a defined, institutionalized element of our society. So once again, thank you to all of you. On Friday, we're having another webinar, and it's going to be called Where's Our Water, Minister Sisulu? Water for All in the context of COVID-19. We are currently tracking the rollout of the 41,000 tanks, etc. So we invite you all also to attend that webinar. Again, thank you to everybody. This has been recorded. If anybody needs it, just ask. It'll also be placed online. Bye-bye. Stay safe.
Thanks to you all.
Bye.